Okay, everyone, today we're going to talk about section 1.4, color. And we'll start by talking about the science of color. In the 1660s, Sir Isaac Newton first discovered that color is a direct function of light. We cannot perceive color without light, which consists of waves of energy. Think about how when it rains and then the sun comes out, we get a rainbow. Or if the sun shines through your window at just the right angle, you might see a rainbow cast on the ground. Well, that's because when white light or normal daylight passes through a prism, it breaks into the different bands of the color spectrum. So, although we think of objects as having certain colors, that's actually a misconception. It all depends on the reflected light. So, depending on the light source or the strength and clarity of the light, the color that we see can change. So a great example of how color depends on light is seen in atmospheric perspective. So we talked a bit about that last time and how the increasing amount of atmosphere between a viewer and an object affects the color it seems to be, or the color that we perceive it to be. So rocks that are brown or hills that are green will take on this bluish hue as we see here in Asher B. Duran's Kindred Spirits. Our perception of color is the result of the interaction between light and pigment. The colors that we see in objects are the portions of the light spectrum that a surface fails to absorb and instead reflects. So if a surface contains blue pigment, when white light hits it, all other colors in the spectrum are absorbed, while blue is reflected back to our eye. The light of the visible spectrum includes the basic colors that we see: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. A color wheel places different hues in visual arrangements to help guide many attributes of color. So a hue is a sort of general classification of a color or color group. There are distinctive characteristics of a color as seen in visible spectrums. For example, we can have red as a broad group of colors, or we can have a more specific version of red, a more specific red hue, such as blood red or scarlet. The three most primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, and these cannot be created by mixing any other two colors. Secondary colors can be created by mixing two primary colors. For example, yellow and red makes orange, yellow and blue makes green, or red and blue makes violet. If you mix a primary color and a secondary color, you get a tertiary color. For example, red-violet, yellow-green, red-orange, etc. Wassily Kandinsky's yellow, red, and blue shows how the artist is utilizing the basic colors of a traditional color wheel as well as black and white. Kandinsky was interested in simplifying and celebrating art and design in its most pure sense. And since no primary color can be mixed from any other colors, the three colors yellow, red, and blue exemplify the purest and most simplest colors available. So during the 19th century, there were many scientific color theories that were published, and a lot of painters tried to take advantage of these. Some painters stopped using black entirely because it was not considered a color from the natural spectrum, and this included several of the Impressionist painters. So Impressionist painters attempted to render effects of light by representing perceptual reality. So they wanted to capture colors as they were perceived in reality, as subject to the ever-changing effects of light. Here we have a work by Camille Pissarro titled Palette with a Landscape. So a palette refers to the wooden board on which a painter mixes their paint, but it can also refer to a range of pigments used by a painter. So we have sort of a double meaning here in the title. And then he's left the primary colors across the edge at the top there. We have blue, red, yellow, and white. to show us how he's used those colors to create this impressionistic landscape of a farmer and his wife with their hay wagon. So now we'll talk about some of the more specific dynamics of color, and we'll begin with color temperature. So we associate colors with different temperatures because of our previous experiences. Traditionally, the red, orange, yellow side of the color wheel are considered warm colors because of their association with things like sunlight and fire, whereas the blues and green side of the color wheel we call cool colors, and they're typically associated with the sky, water, shade, etc. Color temperature is considered relative to colors nearby, and truly it relies on previous experiences or memories of the viewer. So the interpretation of color temperature is highly subjective. Looking at another Impressionist artist, so again, an artist interested in capturing the ever-changing effect of light on the way we perceive the world around us. And here looking at Claude Monet. So Monet created several groups of paintings that explore the color, light, and form of a single subject at various times of day. But his Rouen Cathedral series was his most intense effort at a single site. So each canvas is an exercise in capturing the atmosphere between Monet and his subject, and how the effect of different weather conditions and light, humidity, brightness, shadow, and haze change the way that subject is perceived. And that applies to the colors perceived of that subject as well as the clarity in which we see it, and other details. Here's another great example of one of these studies by Monet with his Haystack series. You can see the use of various hues, various values, all to capture the changing effect of light on a subject. Complementary colors are those that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. Mixing complements results in gray or black. Complementary colors dull each other when mixed. However, if you place two complementary colors next to one another, they react more vividly or intensify one another because they are of markedly different wavelengths, and our eye tries to compensate for that. For example, sticking with Claude Monet, here's his Fisherman's Cottage from 1882. We have this really intense orange roof juxtaposed next to the blue sea, kind of showing the brilliance of this calm summer's day. And this would also be a great example to talk about warm and cool colors, and how we relate those to our past experiences. Another great example of complementary colors being used to increase the intensity or vibrancy of a work here in Frederick Church's Twilight in the Wilderness, with these intense reddish orange clouds against a very calm, cool blue hue sky. One more example of how complementary colors intensify each other when placed next to each other. Here in Hopper's Gas from 1940, all of this green foliage in the background surrounding these red gas pumps really intensifies them, brings our focus in on the pumps and the man standing next to them. So analogous colors are those that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel. They are similar in wavelength, so they don't create the optical illusion that complementary colors do, but rather they create a sense of unity or harmony. Another Impressionist work, this is Mary Cassatt's Boating Party of 1893 and 4. And so she's using colors from the same side of the color wheel, analogous colors, these greens, blues, and yellows. And overall, that creates a more relaxed feeling, a kind of harmonious sense to this composition, as well as implies the kind of calm, leisurely activity of a family outing on the lake. We've looked at Aiken's Bigwin Brothers bracing previously, but let's talk about it for a moment in terms of a color analysis. So we have some complementary colors here, this royal blue of the hat, along with this kind of red-orange of these boats, and the reds that are dotted along the background of these other rowers here, kind of emphasizing the action of the scene here by placing these complementary colors nearby to each other. And then we also have analogous colors. We have the trees and the sky, the green and blue, the trees and the land, sort of this darker, shadowy blue below in the water. Really communicates this kind of sense of peacefulness, of a quiet, again, summer's day on the lake here. But overall, this is a pretty balanced composition in terms of cool and warm tones or analogous and complementary colors. So the four basic properties of color are hue, value, saturation, and tone. We've already talked about hue a little bit. It can be an individual color within a larger range of a spectrum. For instance, red, yellow, blue, green, orange, and violet. Or it can be a more distinct, kind of more specific hue of that broader color. For example, it might be helpful to think about it in terms of all of the varieties of colors you see when using crayons. And this little chart is a nice visual example of how the Crayola color spectrum has expanded since its invention in 1903. Now we've talked about value as a relative lightness or darkness of something, but that was mostly in terms of black and white. But we can also talk about value as the relative lightness or darkness of one hue compared to another. And so hues that are lighter than their basic or primary hue we call tints, which these are colors that are mixed with white, so they are lighter than their original. Colors that are mixed with black or that are darker than their basic hue we call shades. So the closer we get to white, we are higher in value, whereas the closer a color gets to black, the darker or the lower in value. And in terms of value, we can have a neutral value scale, which implies an absence of color, generally using grays, whites, blacks, sometimes other neutral earth tones like browns, or we can have a monochromatic palette or range of values. So in a monochromatic work, it uses only one hue, but in a variety of values. Grisaille is a style of monochromatic painting limited to neutral tones, typically brown or gray, that are applied to a mid or neutral toned background. This term comes from the French word gris, which means gray. It was a technique popularized in the 15th and 16th centuries, and it really emerged as a form of underpainting. So it allowed artists to build up these layers of shadow, highlights, and contrast before going back in and adding color in transparent glazes. But it was also adopted as a technique for complete works of art, as you can see here, and often it's valued for its expressive effects. So a monochromatic work uses only one hue, but in a variety of values. Mark Tansey's Picasso and Braque is a tribute to the creators of Cubism, and he depicts them as Orville and Wilbur Wright, the innovators of aviation. And here they're shown flying a Cubist collage type machine. Tansey's choice of a monochromatic palette is evocative of both the black and white photos that come from the Wright brothers era, as well as Picasso's own blue period, in which he created monochromatic compositions that rely heavily on value to suggest depth and solidity, which we'll talk more about Picasso's blue period momentarily. But you can really see here how a value scale in a single hue can be very effective at creating the illusion of three-dimensional space or three-dimensional volume and form on a two-dimensional plane. Another basic property of color is saturation, or your book terms this chroma, which is the degree of purity of a color, or the strength of a color. You can think of it sort of as a sponge. If it is highly saturated, you cannot fit any more water into it. So you can think of a color as highly saturated. You cannot fit any more of that color into it. You couldn't fit any more red into this color. In the 20th century, color-filled painters liked to use rich, saturated colors. Barnett Newman's Vir Heroicus Sublimis, or Man Heroic and Sublime, shows us that. Newman was interested in the way that colors would react when placed next to each other. His earlier paintings depicted cosmic themes like creation and birth, but then he moved to more abstract compositions in which he relies on value and saturation for visual impact. So here we have a broad red plane. It's very highly saturated with various subtle changes of red hues to create this sensation that light falls differently across the work. And then we have these vertical lines, which Newman calls zips. These are narrow contrasting colors that run full length of the canvas. Sometimes they're straight edged, made with masking tape, and other times they're more irregular, kind of hand brushed strips. But these are sort of meant to recede and pop out against the canvas to change the visual experience or perception. And Newman really wanted his viewers to stand close to these. And this is a huge mural-sized canvas, so the viewer would be engulfed by the color, which he saw as meeting the artwork on a more intimate and personal level. Here's another color-filled painter, Mark Rothko, using a highly, highly saturated pink and orange and sort of even brighter yellow here. Underneath, you can see it peeking through around the edges and in certain areas. You really truly couldn't fit any more pink into this though, right? But by the end of the 1950s, Rothko had moved away from these bright, sensuous colors. So moving away from the bright, sinuous colors, the pink and the orange, towards these more somber, kind of deeper colors, cooler tones, though still certainly very highly saturated. And there was a certain emotive quality that he was after here, which you may flip back and forth between his white center and this blue, green, and brown and see if they have a different emotional effect. Color-filled painters and other abstract artists owe a lot to their predecessors, like James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who believed that art could be created for art's sake. He was very interested in the aesthetic sensations of art, and he also thought that art should be composed and enjoyed like music, so he often named his paintings after musical compositions or with musical terms. He thought music doesn't need a subject matter to be appreciated, so why should a painting? And so here in his Nocturne in Blue and Gold, he's created a rather calming effect with this monochromatic palette. So except for the distant yellows that are in the fireworks display and a few lights and reflections, this is a monochromatic piece using blues and shades of grayish blue. Really creates this overall sense of calmness. And then we also have this line that contributes to a feeling of stability with these strong verticals and horizontals, though we do have this diagonal of the boat as well that indicates motion, and then the diagonal in the firework that indicates kind of action or energy as well. A tone is a color that is weaker than its most pure state. Tone is a property of a color that is not at its highest saturation or chroma, but it's been dulled from that most intense state. So you can sort of think of tone as a grade color. And though saying a color is dulled or grayed sounds negative, it's not necessarily, and it can create some interesting compositional effects. Paul Klee's Ancient Sound from 1925 here is exploring the tonal qualities of color in association with sound. So Klee here is associating yellows with a bright, high-pitched sound, and then these darker tones as deeper, lower sounds. So again, hue, chroma or saturation, value, tint, shade, tone, all of these are part of the color theory vocabulary. And so I threw this slide in here to kind of help you look at them together and really grasp how they're different. So both light and pigment are essential for the perception of color. However, while colored light mixes to create white, colored pigment mixes to create a muddy brownish gray. Light is transient waves of energy, whereas pigment is made up of solid material. So colored light is simply white light divided. So if we shine two or more colored light beams onto the same surface, the resulting color is brighter, and eventually, by adding more and more colored light, we will get white. We call this an additive color. However, on the other hand, with colored pigment, it's essentially solid particles mixed together and suspended in a binder, and therefore the resulting color is more dull because more of the spectrum of light is absorbed than reflected. And we call this subtractive color. So I've mentioned previously, when mixing complementary colors, the result is a sort of muddy, dull gray or black. But when placing complementary colors next to each other, they intensify each other. And this happens through a process called optical mixing, or sometimes we call optical color. So color is essentially created by our minds based on the perceived visual information. Our brains simplify the huge amount of visual information that we intake and really break it down so that we can understand it faster and easier. With optical mixing, colors seem more intense because they retain their individual intensities, whereas they would appear more subdued or dulled if they were mixed on the palette or canvas. Seurat studied color and optical theory in the late 19th century. He developed pointillism, what he actually called it divisionism, in which he used small dots or points of color placed in close proximity to each other and relied on the eye for color mixing. So he understood that colors next to each other affected how the eye perceives the other colors. He meticulously painted small strokes of individual colors that would be changed visually by the other colors that surround them. So in this work, The Circus, tiny little brushstrokes of color produce vivid colors, but a closer look shows how various hues, tones, and values are created by placing pure colors next to each other. Optical mixing allows hues to retain their individual intensity or vibrancy, whereas if these colors were mixed on a palette and then applied to the canvas, they would seem more dull or grayed, maybe muddy. Here's another example of Seurat's pointillism or divisionism. This is a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. This is sort of an icon of 19th century painting. Seurat has depicted members of various social classes at this park and using this divisionist or pointillist method. The eye really blends these colors together optically rather than the colors being blended on the palette or on the canvas. This composition took Seurat 2 years to complete. It's quite large, it's 10 feet wide, and he approached this very scientifically and methodically. He created about 60 studies in preparation for this work, and then he's also left this sort of border or frame around the edge showing us the complementary colors of those that he's created, right? So similar to the Pissarro palette we saw earlier in the lecture. So color can also have traditional symbolic, psychological, or expressive qualities. It can be symbolic in value or evoke a certain emotion, or perhaps have a certain effect on the way we act or feel. For example, the colors used here in this mosque lamp from the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem reflect a certain influence that is valued in the meditative atmosphere of a holy place. Blue is a cool color with connotations of peacefulness and passivity. It's also associated with water, plant life, or a clear sky. Green has positive associations for Muslims. It's most often associated with the peacefulness of prayer. Color can also affect how we think and feel. For example, red is commonly associated with love and passion, but color psychologists have also noted how the constant exposure to red light has caused increased aggression in certain patients. Artists such as Vincent van Gogh have explored different psychological and emotional effects of color. Here in his night cafe, Van Gogh is interpreting the color of his subject, which is a real cafe, the Café de la Guerre, and he's interpreting the color to express something more than just the physical appearance of the subject. He's interested in the psychological effects of color, and about this work he said, "I have tried to express with red and green the terrible passions of human nature." And so he's depicted this night cafe, kind of a seedy dive bar atmosphere in which the artist and his other friends would gather to drink away their worries, essentially. And so the color used here has really intensified the psychological implications of the scene. He's used this fierce, oppressive red alongside a feverish yellow and a sort of sickly green to create the expression of his own sense that this place had a detrimental psychological influence on its patrons. He's used lurid hues to convey strong feelings of unease and sorrow, and then amplified that feeling with a strange kind of lurching perspective. Overall, there's some sort of menacing quality to this work, but it is quite empty and quiet, a bit lonely as well. So speaking of emotions and color, let's talk about Picasso again. I mentioned his blue period previously. It started at an unclear point, but from about 1900 to 1904, Picasso was young, in his early 20s, and quite poor and also quite depressed. He was inspired by his home in Spain, but he executed most of these paintings in Paris. He was traveling back and forth between Spain and Paris quite a bit at this time. And these weren't very popular. He had a lot of trouble selling works from his blue period. Mostly these deal with themes of poverty, loneliness, despair, marginalization. They look to subjects such as the disabled, the oppressed, beggars, prostitutes, drunks. And they're all very brooding in the sort of tone. On the left here, we have The Blind Man's Meal from 1903, depicting a figure in these gloomy blue tones, kind of lonely, sitting with his crust of bread and his pitcher. His features are a bit elongated and distorted, which I think serve to enhance the perhaps isolated feeling. And then on the right, we have the old guitarist, again, very gloomy blue hues, kind of a lonely, haggard figure, depicted with these flattened forms, really emphasizing the emotional and psychological themes of misery, alienation, and loneliness in these blue period works. So in 1901, Picasso was incredibly depressed after the suicide of a close friend. And La Vie, his work from 1903, or The Life, is considered most often as an ambiguous tribute to his friend and to the life that he would never have. Potentially, there are other interpretations. Um, Maybe this is intended to be a depiction of Picasso and his own um, partner, or his mother and Picasso as a baby. And then the paintings that are on the wall behind them are his way of showing how far he's come. Or perhaps he's simply dealing poetically with the cycle of life and contrasting the security of childhood with the harsh realities of adulthood. Um, we have three stages of human existence shown here, sort of young lovers, a weary, elderly, disillusioned figure, um, and a sort of stoic suffering in the facial expressions here. Um, but really, focusing on the emotive effects of color in conjunction with the subject matter. Less often talked about is Picasso's Rose period. This was from about 1904 to 06. By this time, Picasso was living in Paris full time. He had made some friends and created sort of a support group, and he was feeling happier, though he was still showing some interest in monochromatic compositions. He began to lighten his color palette, reviving it with pinks, reds, and roses. Therefore, we call it the Rose period. Typically, his subjects here deal with carnival performers, harlequins, clowns, and he addresses them in sort of a light, graceful way to celebrate their lives, but to also depict the reality of their lives. These are not the desperate, anguishing blue characters, but they're also not the joyous performers that they are on stage either. Rather, they are depicted in sort of a pensive, melancholic, or dreamy state. They're very humanistic depictions of these performers, almost as if we're allowed a behind the scenes glimpse into their off duty lives. In The Family of Saltimbanque from 1905, he depicts this family of circus performers, kind of stoic, emaciated with these harsh, kind of solemn expressions. There's also this sense of isolation or stillness of the figures. I think the assumption is that circus performers are lively and happy, but no. These are marginalized individuals, very poor, and probably on the verge of being destitute. And Picasso really identified with such figures, the young, transient artists, the poor and neglected who were striving for recognition. So And that wraps up our discussion of 1.4. So I'll leave you with this. We'll compare Picasso's La Vie and his Family of Saltimbanques. And I just want you to consider, how does the color choice make a difference in the overall effect of these works? These are similar in composition, kind of ambiguous in both respects, but one in a pretty monochromatic blue, and the other incorporating these pinks, roses, and oranges. So just give some thought to that.